In a moment, we'll bring in Steve Krakuer, author of Uncovered: How the Media Got Cozy with Power and Abandoned Its Principles and Lost the People. It's a great book I urge you to read. But before we do that, whistleblowers have been in the news lately, and we'll be talking about how the media treats them differently depending on who they are blowing the whistle on. Let me play a little bit of this mashup of how the media talks about them, put together by the folks at Grabien, and, well, you see if you can spot the difference between how whistleblowers were treated in 2019 versus 2023, which is to say, when the target of their actions was Donald Trump versus when it was Joe Biden.
Is a hardworking, patriotic person in the intelligence community who just wants to put the information out there.
The president to call into question the credibility of this whistleblower. They're referring to this whistleblower as the so-called whistleblower.
So-called whistleblower on the Biden family.
Welcome back to So-Called Whistleblower. From the so-called whistleblowers.
See so-called whistleblowers. So-called whistleblower.
And joining me now to discuss all this and much more, author Steve Krakuer. Steve, thank you for joining us. What do you reckon? Is this sort of double standard part of the reason why no one actually trusts the mainstream media anymore?
I think that's a perfect encapsulation of the problem there. It's obvious hypocrisy on one hand, and you look at those dates on the video. I mean, we're not talking very long ago. We're talking about 4 or 5 years ago. It's the difference of one administration to the next. And yes, I think you look in poll after poll, the trust in the mainstream media, the corporate media, Acela media as I describe it, New York and DC, the elites, it's lower than ever. And why is that? It's because the media trust the public so little, and we see that right there in all those clips. They don't even trust the public enough to have any sort of intellectual consistency when they talk about any topics, from COVID to, as you talk about the show here, whistleblowers. It's just night and day depending on who's in charge.
Well, and Steve, a couple hours ago, just before we came on air, I had a look at the New York Times website to see what they were saying about Hunter Biden and the plea deal and the implications of that. Nothing. But they had 2 or 3 stories about Donald Trump and the criminal charges against him and everything else. I mean, is this an example of what you're talking about?
It's so funny you mentioned the New York Times, because The Daily, it's the biggest podcast in the country here in America. It's the New York Times' daily podcast. When you listen to their podcast yesterday, in anticipation of the guilty plea deal that they knew was going to happen, it is point after point of either they don't know what they're talking about, or they are purposely spinning the story to give the public a very wrong impression of what happened here. And then, as we all know how it turned out, the plea deal completely fell apart. And now that episode just looks so ridiculous in retrospect. And the person, Michael Schmidt, who was the lead reporter on that story, actually put out yesterday that he's just now coming to this story. Oh, he hasn't been covering the story for very long. How do we expect him to get the story right when he's just learning all this information, probably from his own paper, that's not been reporting the story at all accurately? He could have easily go to the New York Post right across the street. They've been actually doing some reporting on this. No, from the New York Times on down, they have no interest and no curiosity about this Hunter Biden investigation.
But, Steve, part of the problem then for American politics is that because newsrooms, off of the East and West Coast have had so many budget cuts, they rely on the New York Times and papers like that to set their agenda. Is this distorting politics in America, essentially, that you've got this kind of almost Soviet Izvestia type of paper that's out there setting the agenda for the country?
It is, James. I'm here in Dallas, in Texas, and I have to say, most of the people I encounter are not in the media business. I am in the media business. I'm one of those people that spends all day on Twitter or X, so I'm not the norm. But what I've been very encouraged by is that more and more people who are not overly political, these are people that don't spend their day watching cable news, they understand that the jig is up. They look at places like the New York Times or even CNN, which pains me as a CNN alumni, and they just don't trust them anymore. Their sources, they kind of check in, but they don't trust it. They know they have to go and do their homework, and they can turn to independent media. They can turn to other outlets through Substack, through YouTube, podcasts. There's so many more choices out there that more and more people are turning away from these traditionally objective sources that have completely abandoned that, have no principles anymore, and the public is really onto it.
Now, Steve, I want to ask then, why have they abandoned these principles? There's two options. I'd love you to pick one or tell me if there's a third one. Is it that, the Times and the Washington Post and CNN, they've become ideological cheerleaders, or is it that the business model is now such that since 2016, they have to provide hate clicks for Democrats and Trump haters and tell them things are going to be okay with the Bidens, and that it's a business model more than an ideological tilt? Which is it?
Yeah, the easy cable news answer is to pick one and go strong. It's a bit of both, but I will say I think it's more the latter because, look, the media, the corporate media, whatever you want to call it, has always leaned left in America. When I was in those newsrooms in CNN 10 years ago, it was full of liberals and Democrats, and that was fine because there was still the goal of objectivity, of giving the audience a fair representation of what's happening in the world. There was curiosity. There was still that itch. That has been the same. But what's really changed, as you mentioned, is the business model. There is panic now because they're seeing that less and less people are tuning in or are subscribing or are going to the websites now, obviously in this Biden administration, much more so than Trump. And they've been able to now really embrace their ideology in ways they were discouraged from doing before, and so now they're still that liberal. Yep.
And finally, Steve, I got to ask you too about this poll I saw out of Pew Research this week, which suggested that Democrats value free speech far less than Republicans, and this ties into the whole idea we've seen where these papers and big tech were taking marching orders essentially from the White House on so many issues. How did the Democrats and the left? I grew up in a free speech Democrat journalist household, so the First Amendment was like holy writ to me, but now the left seems to have abandoned that. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, that's the classic liberal position, is very pro-free speech. I consider myself almost a free speech absolutist, and that is now increasingly a conservative principle. It's unbelievable, but really what I think it comes down to is we have had this strong push to label information that maybe the elites or the consensus don't like as misinformation or disinformation or malinformation they're using now, and labeling speech, whether it's written speech or spoken, as dangerous has completely changed the game. Now suddenly we can't just have opinions we don't like or we disagree with, we think are stupid. No, now it's dangerous. And when you start elevating speech to dangerous, you start to get these kind of poll results. It's unbelievable. It's really disturbing. And the problem is it's not just liberals in this country, it's the media themselves that actually think speech is dangerous. That's a huge mess.
Steve Krakuer, thank you so much for the insights, and everybody go out and buy his book.